Hi, I'm Matt from Void Vista, and today I'm proud to introduce you to STRANDS, a cinematically sound-designed collection of bowed and electronic instrumentation for Kontakt. By combining detailed multi-sampling and unique instrument setups, the source sounds at the core of STRANDS offer endless amounts of texture and life ready to add to your music. And when combined with the versatile sound design controls, the results go beyond the typical bowed instrument. Before we dive into the walkthrough, let's listen to some examples and see what STRANDS is capable of. The first thing to notice about STRANDS is that it features just a single instrument NKI file. This means that all the snapshots you just heard were made using the sound design features on its UI, and that also means they can be fully customized to fit your music. Once loaded, we can see STRANDS offers a focused main page with a set of 7 performance controls designed to give you instant expressive control of your sounds. Each performance page also has a dedicated page of parameters which can alter their behavior, such as changing filter types, LFO settings, and even creating custom effects chains in character. At its core, STRANDS is split into 2 layers which can be blended with the Morph control. By default, the Morph control crossfades between the 2 sources. However, using the Morph type buttons, we can also set it to be a simple level control for one of the layers. For instance here, the second layer. You can choose the sound source for each layer by clicking its icon in the bottom corners of the interface. There are 32 different sound sources available. The bows category are characterful instruments performed to create as much organic life and movement as possible. They also have optional release triggers to add more vibe and variety when desired. The effects sound sources are a mix of more abstract bowed recordings and heavily processed electronic sources. Just like the bows, these are all recorded with multiple round robins and often multi-sampled across the keyboard. This creates a sense of lifelike variation and responsiveness that blurs the lines between what's real and what's not. The wave sound sources provide some classic analog waveforms and noise. These were each chosen from an array of hardware synths to find the best blend with the bows and effects. Among these essential building blocks, the ensemble wave is worth a special mention. It is a multi-sampled supersaw, which is carefully tuned to always remain musical across its whole range. When we're happy with the sound source we've selected, we can head back to the main page by closing the sound sources page. As you can see, next to the morph control, we also get pitch controls for each layer, with helpful shortcut buttons to jump up and down by octaves or semitones. We can easily reset the pitch to 0 semitones by command clicking on Mac or control clicking on Windows on the pitch control. We can also fine tune by holding Shift while tweaking the pitch control. I've got a saw wave on both sides, so that should help us hear this. Now it's time to start digging deeper into what Strands can do. Before we look at each of the performance controls and their dedicated pages, let's go through the envelope section. We can open the envelope controls by clicking the ADSR icon just above the morph slider at the bottom of the main page. Depending on which snapshot is loaded, you'll see either 1 or 2 sets of envelope controls. We control this by turning on or off envelope link. When link is turned on, the single set of controls will control both layers for speedy editing. Both layers have 3 envelopes, amp, pitch, and filter. The amount sliders to apply the pitch and filter envelopes are just below the selection switches. With link turned off, these envelopes can be used to create complex multi-stage sounds, like in this preset, Cavern Slide. When a layer uses a bow sound source, the amp section will feature an option to turn on release triggers. These are special samples which are triggered when the keys are released to create more natural or unique ends to notes. In Strands, some of these are more subtle, such as on Acoustic Clean, whether the samples of the natural note decays, and others, like acoustic chaotic, are more aggressive to add another texture to the sound source. We can use the gain control to make the release triggers more subtle or dramatic. However, there's actually more going on here. Under the hood, Strands will also auto-level the release triggers based on the natural attack of the chosen sound source and the amp settings used. The result is an incredibly responsive set of release triggers which follow the dynamic of your playing. Above the envelope selection switches is the sample start offset control. We record our samples to capture as much character as possible in the attack, so you may want to increase this if you ever want the sound to feel more responsive. The control has a range of 4 seconds, allowing it to be used creatively. For instance, to create percussive sounds or focus in on a specific aspect of a sound source. It's worth noting this feature is not available on wave sound sources as it would have no effect. In the top right of the envelope section, we can see a control called Cascade. This control delays layer 2, which can help us separate the two layers. We can even sync this control to create a musical call and response in our sounds. So with 6 envelopes available in total, as well as intelligent release triggers, sample offset and cascade, there is so much potential to sculpt the sound sources in the envelope section of Strands. Let's move on and start to look at the 7 performance controls and their pages. We'll begin with Dynamic, which is a pre-effects volume control with a few tricks up its sleeve. It allows you to easily perform flowing dynamic changes, much like you'd find on traditional orchestral libraries. Dynamic always controls the dynamic range all the way from silence to unity, but we can choose to only map a certain amount of this range. I'll walk through the mapping of performance controls later in the video. By clicking the label underneath any of the main performance controls, we can access their additional parameters. For dynamic, we have a dampening control, which when applied adds subtle filtering as the dynamic control is turned down. This creates a more natural sense of dynamics, with the sound seeming not just to get quieter, but also softer. Velocity adds velocity control over dynamic, including any dampening added. The main dynamic control still controls the overall level even when using velocity to allow you to still control the macro dynamic of the sound. Following dynamic, we have filter. The performance control is your main cutoff frequency. Then we can choose between low, band and high pass filters for each layer and control the resonance of the filters. The spacing control allows us to offset the cutoff frequency of layer 2 higher or lower than layer 1. This way we can separate the two layers but still move both filters with a single performance control. Key track controls the amount both filters follow the incoming MIDI. And we can also disable either of the filters. This is particularly useful when making sounds using a wave sound source on one layer. Combined with the individual filter envelopes for each layer, these filters can really help to sculpt your sounds. Let's move on to motion. The motion performance control is a master amount control for two LFOs, which can affect the amp, pitch, filter, and pan of both layers. Let's reset the motion controls and see what we have to play with. In the middle of the motion page, we can control the amount the LFOs will each affect amp, pitch, filter, and pan, with tabs to choose between the two sets of outputs. The LFOs feature the same controls mirrored on the left and the right of the page. We can choose a wave shape with the selection buttons. Below that, we choose if the LFO is synced or unsynced and control its rate. The switch above the wave shapes chooses whether the LFO re-triggers whenever a new note is played or is free running. And if the LFO is re-triggering, the fade control allows us to fade in the LFO after a note is played. And finally, we can take motion one step further by using LFO1 to modulate the amplitude and rate of LFO2 using the controls above or below the amount sliders. All this means, if you ever find a snapshot where motion's behavior isn't quite right for your track, maybe the timing's just a little out, or you want to change the wave, you can easily open the page and get it sitting right where you want it. Now onto layers. This performance control mixes in a pair of additional voices to thicken up a sound. We can control how wide these additional voices are and also detune them from the main voice to make the effect more dramatic. If ensemble is active, the additional voices will be played using different samples. If you turn this off, all three voices use the same sample and layers can be used as a sort of chorus effect. As layers is essentially multiplying the number of voices being played by 3, it increases the CPU usage. The active switch lets you disable the layers feature for sounds that don't need it to avoid unnecessary CPU usage. The LoFi section of Strands can play quite a few different roles depending on how you configure it. As with the other performance controls, LoFi is a master amount control, so if it's a 0, there'll be no effect. There are 4 potential characteristics LoFi can control. Noise controls the level of a constant background noise source, which can be used to simulate the sound of tape hiss, an old wire recorder, intimate room noise, or ambience from a larger performance space. Constant noise like this can really help to glue a sound in a mix, or create a sense of pressure when it's pushed into compression or distortion. Warble simulates the pitch instability found on old tape and vinyl records. Tone dampens high and low frequencies to create that slightly dead timbre we associate with lo-fi recordings. And saturation can add anything from subtle harmonics to outright tape destruction, depending on how far you push it. So we could use a blend of all these controls to recreate a typical lo-fi character, or we could also just use simply a distortion or some room noise to help glue a sound together. It's up to you. Moving on, character is the performance control which can probably have the most variety in how it sounds. The performance control is a dry-wet blend for a 3-stage effects chain. The effects are rooted in serial and can be used to create drastic changes which can then be blended back to the original signal. We can choose which effect slot we are controlling with these tab buttons, bypass them with the power buttons, and even copy and paste effects between slots using the buttons which appear to the right of the effect name. There are 12 different effects available in each slot: a convolution reverb, a compressor, a distortion, shelving EQ, dual band parametric EQ, chorus, phaser, flanger, resonator, scanning resonator, diffusion delay, and an amp simulator with multiple cabinet options. I won't go into detail about these effects in this video, but you get up to 6 controls for each effect, as well as an output volume per effect slot on the right-hand side to help with gain staging. Let's listen to a few examples of a basic sound going through various character setups so you can get an idea of what is possible. One effect that is worth an extra mention is convolve. Not only are we provided with 18 curated reverb choices, which can be reversed to create hypnotic effects like in this preset back and forth, but you can also drag and drop your own impulse response samples to make use of your favorite reverbs or other creative effect impulses. It's worth noting that some effects can cause higher CPU usage, especially on Windows machines. This is due to some behaviors within Kontakt that are beyond our control. So take care when using the diffuse effect or very long impulse responses in convolve. The final performance control, send effects, is a unique send level control, which manages to push past a one-to-one relationship into huge washed out effects, but without cutting off reverb and delay tails when the level is brought back down. The send effects are a parallel delay and reverb which are blended using the central crossfader control. The delay can be free or BPM synced and has a stereo control which increases a ping-pong style spacing. It also has a dampen control, which can be used to darken delay repeats, creating more subtle delay tails. The reverb is an algorithmic reverb with pre-delay to help avoid the slurring that can occur when using larger reverbs. The time control has a huge range from 0.5 seconds to 20 seconds, so it's capable of creating tight spaces or huge washes. Size and mod control the density and movement in the reflections, while tone controls the brightness of the verb. Different combinations of all these can drastically change the vibe of the verb. So, having covered all the performance controls and their associated pages, let's take a look at the final page of Strands. The MIDI Settings page is accessed via the MIDI symbol in the top right of the interface. We chose to create our own MIDI mapping system for the performance controls to give better visual feedback and make changing mappings easier than using Kontakt's built-in method. The mod amount controls are overlaid on top of the performance controls and Morph slider. We can use these to define how much a MIDI control will change the performance control. Attached to each control, we also have a switch to choose between Aftertouch and CC as the mod source, and also the ability to choose which CC number is associated with the control. By default, these will always be set to 1 to allow control via the mod wheel. We can also use the Learn buttons to quickly assign a controller and even learn multiple mappings at once. With CC settings set to global, Strands ignores the MIDI controller number and Aftertouch switch settings associated with snapshots. An example use case for this would be if you have an XY pad you'd like to use. You can assign it with one preset open and then change presets without having to reassign it every time. The other controls in the MIDI settings page relate to the keyboard input. First, we have voices, which allows you to limit the number of notes played. Again, we created our own system for handling this, as the layers and release triggers features generate extra voices for every note played. So by having our own system, we can make sure no necessary voices are being dropped. At the bottom of its range, we get a mono mode, which can be helpful when making basses and similar patches. Due to the nature of the envelope and LFO setups in Strands and limitations of Kontakt, the mono mode is retrigger only and there's no legato option. We can use key range to limit the playable range directly from the UI, which can be really helpful when stacking multiple instances. Then for each of the layers, we have a pitch bend amount control. If these are unlinked, using the link button below, adding a pitch bend on just one layer can create some really great effects. Finally, we also have independent glide controls for each layer with a link option. The glide control also has an intensity setting which can be used to limit its range for more subtle gliding effects when desired. The final controls to mention on this page are the pitch lock buttons next to the pitch controls for each layer. When this is turned on, it will shift the incoming MIDI to compensate for that layer's pitch settings. This means we can, for instance, dramatically pitch down the samples of a sound source and then still play it back at the expected pitch. So that covers it for the features of Strands, but before we wrap things up, I'd just like to take a look at the Snapshots library. If you're using Strands in Kontakt 7, 7 Player, Complete Control, or Machine, you can hear audio previews of the presets in the browser to help speed up finding that perfect sound. It's worth keeping in mind that the note these previews play is always a C, so it may sound a little jarring if out of key with your track. You can also filter the presets by different characteristics and sound types. Strands snapshot library is also divided into 4 banks, which, when Strands is selected in the browser, can be viewed here at the top of the presets list, or here in the Snapshots drop-down menu on the instrument interface. The first bank, Highlights, is a small selection of our favourite snapshots which best show off the sonic possibilities of the instrument. You'll have heard many of these throughout the video. Designed is a bank of heavily sound design snapshots that make use of all of Strands' features. Foundations is a bank of snapshots designed to focus on the individual sound sources, giving a consistent playing experience for all of them. For instance, the Mod Dynamics snapshots use the mod wheel to control dynamics and work fantastically when layered over traditional orchestral libraries. For this example, I've got the cello and violins from the Kontakt 7 factory library. Here they are on their own. Now, here they are with various Mod Dynamics snapshots from the Foundations folder. Finally, Morphs is a bank of pre-configured morph blends between different sound sources. It can provide a great way to find a variation from a sound source you're already using or as a starting point for creating your own sounds. Let's listen to a few examples from the Acoustic Clean folder. So that's it for this video. I hope this has inspired you to explore everything that's available in Strands. For more tips and tricks, and to keep up to date with updates, please subscribe to the channel and follow our socials. Links are in the description.